Nestled along Florida's Space Coast lies the small marshy town of Satellite Beach.
So that area as a whole is hot, humid, much of the year. It's really humid. It's like walking through soup. But it's just a gorgeous, very lush place to live.
Think so?
Hey, how was everything?
Oh, everything was great.
Good.
Thank you.
Can I get you anything else?
No, just the check. That's fine.
It's the summer of 2000, and 22-year-old Misty Morse is counting the minutes until she finishes her waitressing shift.
All right. Here you go, ma'am. That should cover the bill, and just keep the rest for a tip. You were great.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Have a good one, okay?
You as well.
You too.
Thank you. Yeah, so.
Misty was a friend magnet. She just had this personality type that drew you in, and you couldn't help but love her.
Oh my God, what did you do that for, you jerk?
Come on, Misty, that's what best friends are for. Are you ready to go?
After I'm done cleaning up your mess? Yeah.
Caleb Walker and Misty Morse have been friends since their days in middle school.
What's with the Audrey Hepburn?
The next morning, Linda wakes up to find Misty still isn't home.
I remember Linda saying that it wasn't unusual for Misty to take off and be gone for a few days. Misty's a grown woman, so her mom wasn't worried.
Linda heads straight to work, believing it's just a matter of time until Misty's back home. But that all soon changes.
Misty, you better have a good reason why you didn't take the dry cleaning in. Well, you could have called.
Hey, it's Misty. You know what to do.
Of course, you forgot to charge your phone.
Misty didn't have any cash. Her cell phone was dead. She would be expecting her to come home pretty soon.
But one day turns into the next with no word from Misty. And by day 4,
Misty?
Linda is worried sick.
Where are you?
Nine miles away, retired Judge Lawrence Anderson is in the back of his Merritt Island home along the murky Indian River when a foul smell grabs his attention.
He actually thought it was a manatee. It washed up on his yard. It would be a very logical assumption for him to think, especially since he saw the manatee the day before.
But the judge quickly realizes it's no manatee. At 5:30 p.m., Detective Gary Harrell with the Brevard County Sheriff's Office arrives at the crime scene.
We gotta stop meeting like this, Detective.
Frank, what do we got?
Well, old Judge Barrett discovered a floater and scared the hell out of her. But we already pulled a body from the Indian.
All right. I gotta take a look.
Wait, it's a bad one.
Terry?
White female, advanced state of decomposition. I think she's been in the drink for at least a couple of days.
Any ID?
No, she was nude, except, well, see for yourself.
We'll let the inmate make this official, but it's safe to say this is a homicide. Whoever did this, they didn't want this poor girl to get found or even get away. See these bags? These were used to weigh the body down. That knot, right here on the cord. You ever seen something like that before?
It's definitely not run of the mill.
It wasn't just something as easily as that she could have gotten caught in them in the current, and this was something that tied around her hands and her feet by chance of moving in a long stream. These were tied by somebody who knew what they were doing.
Motor?
Possibly, but it doesn't really narrow it down in this neck of the woods. Once word leaks out that a dead body is found behind the judge's house, news vultures will be circling.
Well, let's use those bloodsuckers to our advantage.
On the scene now, where the story is unfolding, police are asking for the public's help after a young woman was pulled from the Indian River this afternoon. Details remain unclear, but police say they do suspect foul play.
My baby.
Terry?
White female.
After a young woman is pulled from the Indian River, Linda Morse fears the worst.
My baby.
Could it be her 22-year-old daughter, Misty, who's been missing for 4 days?
I didn't know Misty was missing at all until Linda called.
Hello?
It's our baby.
Whoa, Linda.
Misty's mom and I split up in mid-1996. I had moved to the West Coast.
She didn't come home the other night. And now the police have found a woman in the Indian River. And I think it's Misty.
Okay, let me get back to you, okay? I'll call you back.
You don't expect to get that call. It's not supposed to work that way. Misty's mom and I raised her on the water practically. It was devastating to hear that Misty could be in the water.
The next morning, Brevard County Detective Gary Harrell meets with medical examiner Bevan Nobles to review autopsy findings.
Did you even sleep last night?
You know what they say about the early bird. What can you tell me?
No gunshot wounds or knife wounds, but there's so much decomp I can't give an exact cause of death.
Best guess?
She could have died from asphyxiation or drowning.
So she could have been alive when she was dumped.
It's possible, just don't know 100%.
It's a horrible thought to think that she might have been alive when she was thrown in the river with her hands bound and her feet. It's just one of those things you don't like to think about for too long because it's pretty grisly, pretty disturbing.
What do we know for sure?
We've traced the plastic bags on her feet to a popular local grocery chain. This is called spline. It's used to fasten window screen.
Hard to find?
Nah, pretty common. The rope is a little harder to find. It's actually used almost exclusively by boaters. Same with the tape. It's called sail tape.
This is a big lead. We have someone that has probably access to boats in the river and some type of training.
Anything on the knots?
No. You should check upstairs. We fingerprinted her this morning. They may have ID'd her by now.
Great. Thanks, Alex. You get a hit?
Misty Morris, 22. Got an address on Satellite Beach.
I put myself in that spot. I have daughters that age. It hurts going there and thinking how I'm gonna tell Linda that her daughter's dead.
Miss Morse?
It's Misty, isn't it? I saw the news last night.
Yes, ma'am. I'm afraid so.
You can't imagine what someone's going through at that point. But I would want somebody working as hard as they could to solve my child's murder. And that's the way I looked at it with Misty. When I first met with Linda and told her and confirmed it was her daughter that was found, she's going, she starts to cry. She's hurting. There's nothing I can do about that. I know that. But my mission there is to get as much information as I can. I can't tell her, hey, I'll be back the day after tomorrow, get yourself together and think about this so we can, I need to know now because I know there's a killer out there. And he knows that I found the body at this point because it's all over TV. And time is now against us. So I wanted to interview Linda then, and I had to wait until Linda was ready, which she's a strong woman. It only took a short time. She knew what she had to do. She, I think, knew deep down that, hey, I got to tell him everything I can. And she did a great job in giving me a taped interview then. And it really led to the next steps and ultimately to the killer.
Can you think of anybody that would want to hurt Misty?
Brent Huck, Misty's ex. They used to live together, but then the relationship turned sour.
Well, ex-boyfriends, that's a great place to start because usually they're the ones that are going to have some history or a motive.
When did they break up?
Oh, more than a year ago.
I don't want to get tunnel vision and steer straight to him. I went with the now people.
What about the other people in her life now, like a current boyfriend or coworker?
I don't know. I just wish that I could.
It's okay. I know this is really tough for you right now. Why don't you tell me when you last saw Misty?
She came home from work. I was asleep on the couch. She came out to show me what she was wearing and... Oh, wait. Hold on. She went into the bedroom to talk. Hey. I fell back asleep. The next day I went into her room and her keys were there and her wallet, but her ID was missing and her cell phone was dead.
Do you know who called her?
I don't know. Misty had a lot of friends, a lot of boys, but I don't know which ones were boyfriends.
Why don't you give me a few of their names and I'll get started with following up with them.
Try Caleb Walker first. He was like a brother to Misty. Always looked out for her.
The way Linda made it sound was he was kind of like a guy pal, a friend. But Linda also gave me these names of who she was seeing now. There were several young men.
This is a good list to start from. If you can think of anything else that'll help me, please give me a call.
Thank you.
We're looking at the list and wondering which one of these guys is it. Whoever called, it may or may not be the killer. That's the last time that we knew that anybody ever spoke to her.
To help trace the call, Detective Harold reaches out to Misty's cell phone store, asking about the call that came in at 2 a.m. Customer service confirms Linda's story about Misty receiving a call in the wee hours of the night.
Is there any chance that you're going to tell me who the number's listed to?
Company policy states I can't give out that information without a subpoena.
This is murder.
Nothing I can do. Sorry.
But I needed it now. I didn't have time to wait for that information to come. You know, it's very frustrating when you have to wait on subpoenas.
Day not going so well?
I've had better.
Well, the ME wanted me to pass along that she found a strand of hair on the cell tape.
Tell me it's not Misty's.
It's not.
Yes.
Your ears burn a little bit, you perk up. Wondering what kind of hair it is.
Actually, it's probably not the killer's either.
What?
According to the ME, it's not even human. It's canine.
It's safe to assume that, wherever she was killed, there was a dog at that location.
Wow. Now there's something we can work with.
Keeping this detail in mind, Detective Harold sets out to interview the people on Linda's list. He starts with Misty's longtime friend, Caleb Walker.
Sheriff's Department, open up.
Knowing it was dog hair at this point, we needed to find a dog owner.
Got a dog? I thought I heard barking when I knocked.
No, it's just me here.
He doesn't seem to have any knowledge of boating, and he just didn't have a dog. Nothing matched Caleb.
I can't believe Misty's gone, I wish I'd spent more time with her, but she just seems so distracted.
I thought you guys were joined at the hip.
We were, until recently. Last time I saw her, she was going off about this new guy she'd been seeing, Marcus Jeffries.
Marcus, man, I've got it bad.
I didn't like the guy. He was in with the drug crowd, and I didn't want that for Misty, but she met him at her new job, too, which is just another reason not to like the guy.
The restaurant? What?
No, her other job.
What other job?
So this massage parlor was kind of out of left field. I'm thinking, as a detective, how many suspects am I going to get out of this?
And this is where she met that Marcus fella?
I don't know.
Armed with the new lead, Detective Harold drops in on the business.
Welcome. I'm Star. How may I brighten your evening?
Well, darling, I suppose you could start by shining some light on where I can find Marcus Jeffries.
Oh? You and Marcus want a massage together?
Look, I don't have time for games. With the Sheriff's Department. Where's Marcus?
I don't know. He hasn't been around the shop for a while.
Is he a regular customer?
No. He just comes by now and then because his sister Tammy works here. Did he do something wrong?
I don't know. What can you tell me about Misty Morse?
She works here. Haven't seen her in about a week, though.
That's because she's dead. When was the last time you saw her?
She started her shift at 7:30 and got off work right before 10.
Get changed. I'll be back in a minute.
According to Star, Misty's last shift was Wednesday, the night she disappeared.
Not a bad night. See you later.
Did Misty have any issues with clients? Maybe somebody that was coming on stronger than she could handle?
No way. None of the girls do anything they don't want to do. Misty never complained once.
Call me if you find anything that you think might be able to help me.
Swear.
It was a dead end. Nothing developed there. It wasn't what I was hoping for, which is bad.
Determined to track down Marcus Jeffries once and for all, Detective Harrell reaches out to Misty's mom, Linda, for help.
Miss Morris, Detective Harrell, what more can you tell me about Marcus Jeffries?
Not much, really. Misty mentioned him a few times recently, but nothing stands out. I do know he called the house looking for Misty after she went missing.
It wouldn't be the first time a killer called his victim after she's dead, to throw detectives off the trail.
I'm thinking, okay, now Marcus might be our guy.
His number? No, I don't have caller ID.
Don't worry. I'll track him down.
Detective Harrell digs into Marcus's background. Turns out, he's no choir boy.
Well, looky here.
Been arrested for burglary, for bad.
You ever get in any trouble in the Navy?
The Navy. You're not a very good detective, because that's a lot of crap.
Hey, come on, Marcus.
Look, I don't know who's telling you that, but that's not the truth. I won't even get on boats.
Stop the BS. Talk straight to me. Did you kill Misty?
No. No, I didn't kill Misty. I was with my friends the night that she disappeared. You can call them.
You know what? I will. I will call them. You can go for now. But I'll be watching you. And don't go far.
Yeah, you got it, Chief.
There's no boat, there's no dog. I asked him about the phone calls. The timeline didn't match, there's nothing there. So, talking with him and just having that feeling he's not our guy, it's time to keep moving, move on.
Detective Harrell returns to the list of names provided by Misty's mom, Linda.
God's given me the opportunity to be this last advocate for this person. I'm the last one to fight for him, to do the right thing. So when she ran out that night to meet whoever was picking her up, she took 2 items, cell phone, driver license. What happened?
Determined to find out, Detective Harrell drops in on one of Misty's more recent male friends, Jeremy Copeland. And turns out,
Sheriff's Department, open up.
he doesn't live far from where Misty's body was dumped into the river.
How can I help you?
I just have a couple of questions about Misty Morse. You know her, right?
A little.
Tell me about it.
There's not much to tell. We just started dating a couple weeks ago. We actually only went out once, but I've been trying to make plans with her ever since. She's just not too good about calling back.
What about last Wednesday, the 19th? Try calling her then?
Yes. That's the last time I spoke with her.
Jeremy, he surprised me saying that he talked to her the last day that she was known to have been alive, the 19th of July.
When'd you call? Like 2 a.m.?
No. She was still at work. 7:30 or 8 o'clock that night, probably. I want to see you tonight after you get off.
No, I can't. I have plans.
Okay.
I'll hang out next weekend?
All right. Good night.
Did you make any plans with anybody?
I didn't ask, and we never got together that weekend. I tried calling her cell, but it just rings and rings.
Well, it's clear that she's not that interested. I mean, why keep calling?
I can take a hint. I just... Give me a sec. I wanted to give her this back.
driver's license.
Her ID was missing.
We knew that the only two items missing were her driver license and cell phone.
Well, I sure hope you have a good reason why you have Misty's ID.
When we went on the date 2 weeks ago, Misty left her purse, so she asked me to hold it for her. Forgot to give it back to her at the end of the night, and I've been trying to get it back to her ever since. I just can't get her to answer the phone.
She can't answer the phone. She's dead.
What?
They pulled her body out 3 days ago out of the Indian River. Right where you put her.
No, I wouldn't hurt Misty. I didn't kill her.
Yeah, just tell it to your lawyer.
You gotta believe me. What about her boyfriend?
Who? Marcus?
No, his name is, Brent.
Her old boyfriend?
Yeah, she said he was abusive, hit her, even broke her jaw once.
But they broke up over a year ago.
Yeah, but they still see each other. He called Misty a couple times the night I was with her, wanting to get together. She said he was an abusive guy, like a Navy SEAL or something.
Navy?
Those knots are taught in basic training.
He's a ex-SEAL. He's our guy we gotta go find next.
About 3 days after 22-year-old Misty Morse was tied up and tossed into Florida's Indian River, Detective Gary Harrell has learned she had an abusive ex-boyfriend, Brent Huck.
Linda, it's Detective Harrell. Do you know where Brent Huck lives? Okay, I got it. Thanks.
I go to see Brent Huck. It's a July day, hot, humid already. I get to his house. He lives on the southern end of Merritt Island. This is his parents' house, his boyhood home. He stayed at his parents' house a lot. They were in the Bahamas. I'm looking at Brent's house where he lives. He lives on the water. There's boats available to him. You know, I'm trying to get too excited, but it's hard not to get excited about things are starting to fall in place a little more.
Can I help you?
Yeah, I'm Detective Harrell. Want to ask some questions about Misty Morse.
Oh, yeah, I heard. It's terrible what happened to her.
What happened there?
Oh, well, I fell off my skateboard.
So you got time to talk about Misty?
Yeah, sure, yeah. My parents are on vacation. I'm house sitting. What?
You and Misty used to be serious, right?
Yeah, we used to live together. It didn't work out. Just came from two different worlds. Broke up about a year ago, and I started seeing a new girl.
The way I hear things, it wasn't completely over.
We still hooked up.
Even though you had another girlfriend.
Guilty.
This guy is slimy. He still saw her from time to time, and I'll press that a little more.
Look, I thought Misty and I had an understanding. You know, she wasn't gonna be Mrs. Huck, but last Wednesday, I heard she was spreading a rumor about me. So I called her up.
Hey! Wait, what? No. No, I didn't say that.
You called her?
Yeah. She was telling people she was pregnant with my kid. If that got back to my girlfriend, she would dump my ass. So I bitched her out and I told her to stop.
You never saw her that night?
I didn't kill her.
Hey, take it easy. I didn't say you did. Look, why don't we search your residence? Take a look around, get you ruled out, and we'll be on our way.
Sure. Whatever you want.
Let me go get my guy.
Well, at this point, we have the motive, perhaps, the pregnancy. He's got to shut her up. I'm thinking now that Brent's, for the first time, the prime suspect.
But without proof, Misty's killer could just as easily still be one of her other male friends. So Harold brings in Agent Terry Laufenberg from the department's crime team to give the house a thorough search. Meanwhile, Detective Harold keeps a close eye on Brent.
So, your parents have dog?
No. Well, I do. I got 2 of them. Real hellions, I tell you.
The evidence that I know we have, okay, the dog hair, there's a source for that. So the dog was exciting.
Need a word.
What you got?
I found screen spine, plastic grocery bags tucked away in the garage, just like from the crime scene.
I knew it.
It gets better. Found the same red diamond pattern rope with the clove hitch and the cow hitch knots.
This rope is exactly the same as what they found on Misty's body.
Slam dunk.
And seeing all these items, the tape, the spline, the bags, the dog hair, we got the motive, the pregnancy. So everything that we have is matching this house, this person, Brent Huck.
Brent Huck is arrested on October 23, 2002, and charged with first-degree felony murder. At his trial, prosecutors paint a vivid picture of what they think happened on that fateful night in July 2000. Fearing Misty's rumor about being pregnant with his baby would leak out to his girlfriend, Brent heads straight for Misty's house.
Hey, I realized a few things. I'm outside. Let's talk in person, all right? Okay, I'll see you soon. Wow.
Hey.
God, you look beautiful. I realize I have to be with you. Here, I want to show you something, okay?
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
Come here.
They drive back to his house there in Merritt Island. From there, he does something to drug her.
So what'd you want to talk about?
Later. Let's have a drink.
All right.
No, come on, drink up. I got plans for us.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. You know I love you, don't you? I just don't think I can live without you.
Baby, I love you. I'm gonna take real good care of you. Oh my God.
Oh. God, that was too much.
You feel all right?
Yeah. No, I don't feel so good.
No? Maybe you should lie down. Yeah.
In a way, but he's the kind of person that always gets taken out in the end. Because somebody comes along that isn't intimidated by him and takes him out.
On July 11th, 2003, Brent Huck is convicted of murdering Misty Morse and sentenced to life in prison. With Misty's killer safely behind bars, her parents are finally able to put their daughter to rest.
Because of Misty's love of the water, her mom and I both agreed that it was appropriate to release her ashes into the water. I remember a wave just kind of came in.
By the time the sun began to lower over Gainesville in late August of 1990, the city was holding its breath without knowing it yet. On the surface, everything looked ordinary in the way college towns often do at the edge of a new semester. Side streets near campus filled with used couches balanced on porches, bicycles chained to stair rails, and boxes half unpacked in student apartments that smelled like detergent, paperbacks, and cheap pizza. Parents had just finished helping their children settle into unfamiliar bedrooms. Roommates were still learning one another's habits, still laughing too loudly to cover the shyness of being strangers suddenly required to share a life. The University of Florida was waking back up after summer, and the town around it was stretching with it. Ready for the return of noise, youth, traffic, football talk, and long, humid nights. There is a particular innocence in a college town at the beginning of term. A fragile kind of optimism that seems to rise from the pavement itself. It lives in open windows, in the rattle of ceiling fans, in the confidence of people young enough to believe that the world is dangerous only in distant, abstract ways. Gainesville had that innocence then. It had all of it, and that is what makes what happened there feel, even now, less like a crime and more like the sudden collapse of a season. The deliberate poisoning of a place that had been built around trust before anyone knew the name Danny Rolling. Before parents across Florida began calling their children with a different tone in their voices. Before students started checking locks twice and peering into dark parking lots with their keys held between their fingers. Gainesville was just another college town standing on the threshold of fall. Then, over the course of a few brutal days, it became something else entirely. It became a city spoken of in whispers, a place where every creak in an apartment hallway sounded like a warning, where every delayed phone call seemed ominous, where the boundary between youth and mortality was ripped open with such force that an entire generation felt the tear. Fear does not always arrive as a scream. Sometimes it drifts in slowly, taking shape through rumor, police lights, and the growing realization that the ordinary rules no longer apply in Gainesville. It began with absence and discovery, a door unopened, a room gone too quiet, the kind of silence that does not feel restful but wrong. Then came the first terrible confirmation, and after that, the second, and then the third. Until the town's pulse changed. Students who had come to Gainesville for classes and parties and football weekends suddenly found themselves studying maps of their own neighborhoods as if they were enemy territory. Parents urged sons and daughters to come home. Young women who had once padded barefoot from bedroom to kitchen in oversized t-shirts began sleeping with lamps on. Men who thought of themselves as protectors began to realize, with a sick and humiliating clarity, that they had no idea how to guard against a predator who moved like weather through unlocked assumptions. The murders were not only killings, they were invasions, not just of homes, but of the mental architecture of safety itself. What makes a bedroom comforting is the belief that it is separate from the outside world. What makes a campus feel alive is the belief that strangers are mostly harmless, that the people moving around you under streetlights are simply other students, other lives, other stories. The person who shattered Gainesville in 1990 understood that terror deepens when it arrives in private places. He crossed thresholds. He entered rooms where people were supposed to be most protected, most unguarded, most fully themselves, and in doing so, he created something larger than grief. He created panic with edges. The kind that spreads from one apartment complex to another, from one dorm room to another, from one conversation to another, until it becomes almost physical. Like heat hanging over asphalt. To understand why the Gainesville student murders lodged themselves so deeply in American memory, you have to understand the timing. The school year was beginning. The victims were young, bright, ordinary in the most heartbreaking sense of the word. They were not people already orbiting danger. They were students. They lived the kind of lives that parents imagine for their children when they send them away to college. Hard studying, late mornings, future plans, small freedoms. There is a cruelty in striking at that stage of life, at that exact moment when adulthood is supposed to open before a person like a road. It leaves behind not only the dead, but the spectacle of stolen possibility. A life cut short is always tragic. A young life interrupted at the moment it is just beginning has a different kind of ache. It forces the living to imagine all the ordinary years that will now never arrive. The apartments in Gainesville still had textbooks on desks, clothes folded over chairs, toothbrushes by sinks, calendars waiting to be filled. That is what horror looks like when it steps into a student town. It does not merely leave bodies behind. It leaves unfinishedness everywhere, and because the murders unfolded in succession, the fear had time to build, to multiply, to become theatrical in the most dreadful sense. Each new crime scene seemed to declare that the killer was still near, still watching, still deciding. The city was not looking back on a single act of violence with shock. It was living inside an active nightmare. That distinction matters. A past crime can be mourned. A present predator changes behavior in real time. Students altered routines. Friends stopped walking alone. Gun stores did business. Police presence thickened. News cameras gathered. The town became both a place of mourning and a stage for vigilance. Every conversation carried an undercurrent. Have you heard? Who was it this time? Where did it happen? Are your doors locked? Fear became communal, but not comforting. Communal fear rarely is. It makes people gather. Yes, but it also makes them suspicious. The face at the window is no longer merely a neighbor. The footsteps outside are no longer just footsteps. The world rearranges itself around the possibility of threat. In later years, people would point to Gainesville when talking about a broader cultural mood that took shape in the 1990s, a mood in which suburban and campus safety no longer felt guaranteed, in which the idea of the masked or unseen stalker moving through familiar American spaces began to grip the public imagination with renewed force. The crimes echoed through news coverage, through parental anxiety, through dormitory lore, and eventually through the darker corners of pop culture. But before there were echoes, there was the immediate reality of blood, shock, and a city unable to sleep. There were patrol cars cruising quiet roads where students once walked home from bars without much thought. There were apartment doors fitted with extra locks. There were mothers listening for steadiness in their daughters' voices over the phone and hearing none. There were fathers saying practical things, because practical things are easier to say than "I am terrified." And above all, there was the overwhelming fact that someone out there had chosen these victims, these homes, these nights, and had done so with a level of violence that suggested not mere impulse, but appetite. That realization is often the moment when murder becomes monstrous in the public mind, not when people understand that someone died, but when they understand that someone wanted to terrify as much as to kill. The Gainesville murders carried that feeling from the start. The scenes left behind were not simply evidence of homicide. They bore the mark of domination, of theatrical cruelty, of someone turning death into a message. That message was received immediately and exactly as intended. It said, "You are not safe here." It said, "Walls will not save you." It said, "Youth is not armor. Friendship is not armor. Daylight plans for the future are not armor." There is a reason communities remember certain crimes long after statistics blur and headlines fade. Some acts of violence injure more than the direct victims. They rewrite the emotional climate of a place. Gainesville in 1990 became a city divided into before and after. Before, there had been the usual careless freedoms of student life. Doors left open for roommates, late-night drives with music up and windows cracked. A faith, half-conscious but real, that evil belonged elsewhere. After, There was a new grammar to daily existence. Check the peephole. Travel in pairs. Call when you get home. Do not assume. The change sounds simple when listed that way. But it isn't simple. It is the loss of innocence translated into routine. It is trauma learning to wear ordinary clothes. And beneath the public panic, beneath the media coverage and police manhunts and campus rumors, there was also the intimate devastation carried by the families of the victims. While a city feared what might happen next, parents, siblings, friends, and lovers were already standing at the edge of an impossible fact. Somewhere in those first terrible days were phone calls that split lives in two. Somewhere, a mother answered the phone expecting an update about classes or groceries or weekend plans and instead entered a world she would never leave. Somewhere, a father who had helped move furniture into a student apartment just days earlier now had to imagine what had happened inside it. Public tragedies are often remembered by place and perpetrator. Private grief remembers smaller details. The last conversation, the tone of a voice. A shirt chosen that morning, a promise to call later. In a case like Gainesville, the public horror was immense. But it was built on individual universes collapsing one by one. That matters. Because when true crime hardens into legend, the victims can begin to blur into symbols. Young students, co-eds. A campus gripped by fear, but they were not symbols when the semester began. They were people in the middle of becoming themselves. Their names belonged in classrooms, on attendance sheets, in birthday cards, in future wedding invitations, in graduations not yet imagined. The killer took their lives, but the larger violence of such crimes is that they threaten to absorb the victims into the aura of the murderer. This is why the story must begin not with him, but with the atmosphere he invaded and the lives he entered like a storm no one had forecast. Danny Rolling would later become a known figure, studied, described, pathologized, fitted into the grim catalog of American serial killers. His name would stick because names like that often do. But at the beginning, he was only a shadow moving through a city still lit by student optimism. A shadow no one had identified, no one had stopped. No one had yet fully understood. That is where the terror lived. Not merely in what he did, but in the invisibility that surrounded him while he did it. He was not a monster in the cinematic sense, not a creature announced by music and lighting. He was more frightening than that. He was a human being capable of entering ordinary spaces and making them unrecognizable. He moved through Gainesville at the exact moment when thousands of young people were arriving to build lives, friendships, and futures against that backdrop. The murders felt almost obscene in their contrast. The city was full of beginnings. He brought endings. The city was filling with laughter. He brought silence. The city was opening itself for a new season. He arrived like a hand closing around a throat. In the days that followed, Gainesville would become a map of dread. Newspapers would circulate names and details. Police would race the clock. Sketches and speculation would spread. The town would learn how quickly rumor can move when a fear gives it legs. Every stranger would acquire a possible double meaning. Every unlocked window would feel like negligence. Every young face on campus would seem, for a moment, heartbreakingly exposed. But the deepest horror of the Gainesville student murders lies in the fact that none of this was visible at the start. The semester began anyway. Cars unloaded anyway. Students laughed anyway. The sky over Florida remained bright and heavy and deceptively beautiful, somewhere beneath that ordinary beginning. A predator was already near, and that is the image that lingers. The one that makes this case feel less like history and more like a warning murmured from one generation to the next. A college town at dusk. Ceiling fans turning behind thin apartment walls. Parents driving home believing their children have arrived safely at the beginning of adult life. Streets warm from the day's heat, windows glowing softly. Music playing somewhere in the distance, and moving through all of it, unseen for the moment, is the thing that will change the town forever. Not a myth, not a movie villain, not a faceless symbol, but a man carrying violence inside him like a private ritual. Approaching a city that still thinks the night belongs to the young, Gainesville in 1990 was the kind of place that seemed to promise reinvention. It sat in north-central Florida with the loose, sun-struck posture of a college town that knew exactly what it was built for. It was not a city of towering skylines or grand urban spectacle. It was flatter than that. Greener than that, more intimate and deceptive in its simplicity. Trees pressed in around roads and apartment complexes. Afternoon light pooled in parking lots and on the hoods of old cars hauled from one semester to the next. The air in late summer felt almost liquid, heavy with heat and damp enough to cling to the skin. Ceiling fans spun constantly, screens hummed with insects after dark. Rain came hard and then vanished, leaving steam to rise from the pavement and lawns to glow again in the returning sun. It was a place where life spilled outward. Students did not live sealed inside private worlds. They moved through shared stairwells, breezeways, laundromats, bars, convenience stores, libraries, and campus lawns. Privacy existed, but it was thin. That is part of what made Gainesville feel young. Everyone was always near everyone else. A neighbor's radio drifted through the wall. A room warrior. Roommates' laughter carried out to the parking lot. Someone always seemed to be coming or going with an armful of books. A bag of groceries, a six-pack. A lamp, a typewriter. A pillow, the loose inventory of lives still in progress. It was a city organized around motion, not permanence. And every August that motion intensified, the University of Florida drew students in from across the state and beyond. And with them came the yearly transformation that college towns know by heart. Empty summer rentals began to fill. Apartment offices ran out of forms. Parents in shorts and sunglasses stood squinting beneath balconies, pointing at plumbing, asking about safety, trying to sound calm and competent while their children hovered between excitement and impatience. Stores near campus sold out of notebooks, extension cords, and cheap dishware. Bulletin boards fattened with flyers. Telephone calls were made from new rooms with that first-night mixture of bravado and homesickness. This was the social weather of Gainesville in late August, a weather made of beginnings. Even people who were not students could feel it. The town swelled with a particular kind of energy, one that mixed anticipation with performance. Freshmen tried on adulthood in visible ways. Upperclassmen pretended to have mastered it. The campus became a theater of first impressions, where every outfit, every conversation, every party invitation, every casual introduction seemed to carry the possibility of changing a life. In such places, the future feels strangely close. It is not yet real, but it crowds the room. You can feel it in the textbooks stacked by the bed, in the applications pinned to corkboards, in the confidence with which young people talk about next year, next summer. After graduation, the sadness of the Gainesville murders is inseparable from this atmosphere because the victims were not living on the margins of society or in worlds already marked as hazardous. They were living in the center of a ritual Americans have long treated as hopeful and almost sacred, the sending away of the young to become themselves. To understand Gainesville in 1990, you have to understand how ordinary that hope was. A student apartment near campus was rarely glamorous. The carpet might be worn. The cabinets might smell faintly of old wood and dust. There might be a stain in the parking lot that never quite washed away, or an air conditioning unit that rattled all night like a machine trying not to die. But none of this mattered much. These spaces were transitional by design. They were not meant to be final homes. They were launch points. Their very imperfection carried a kind of freedom. For many students, they were the first places not fully supervised by parents. The first places where one could stay out late without explanation, cook badly, invite friends over at midnight, decorate a bedroom according to a private taste no one else had to approve. The walls were thin, the rent was shared. the furniture mismatched, but the feeling was intoxicating. Life seemed to belong to the person living it for the first time. In Gainesville, those apartments clustered in neighborhoods close enough to campus to encourage a casual faith in movement. A person could walk home late. A bike could carry you back from class. Friends could stop by unannounced. Doors might be locked, but the culture itself was open. The habits of students are built around familiarity with strangers. You share classrooms with people you barely know. You pass them again at bars, laundromats, libraries, cafeterias. A face seen once becomes a face seen 5 times and then becomes part of the background texture of daily life. This is one of the subtle kindnesses of college towns. They let people believe that the world is smaller than it is, friendlier than it is, more knowable. That same social permeability, of course, can become vulnerability when someone predatory learns how to move inside it. But before that threat is visible, the openness feels like life itself. Gainesville had that feeling in abundance. It was not only the university that shaped the town's identity. Football shadowed everything in season, not yet as a direct presence in the murders themselves, but as part of the larger cultural backdrop. The University of Florida was already a place of intense school pride, and with that came ritual, noise, tribal belonging. Students wore the institution on their bodies, on hats and shirts and bumper stickers. The city's rhythms bent around academic calendars and game days. To live there was to live inside a temporary republic of youth, ambition, and communal excitement. Even the weather seemed to participate. Mornings opened bright and wet. Evenings drew down slowly, the sky fading through long layers of orange and purple while street lamps clicked on and conversations gathered outside apartment doors. It was the sort of environment in which danger could seem abstract, precisely because daily life felt so shared. This is one of the great psychological paradoxes of communal settings. The more surrounded people feel, the less alone they believe themselves to be. Even when they are physically alone in a room, a student going home at night in Gainesville was not walking into a wilderness. She was walking into a dense web of neighbors, classmates, traffic, routines, familiar architecture. The illusion of safety was not foolish. It was built from real signs of human presence, but presence is not the same as protection. And 1990 was still an era in which many of the habits of personal security that later hardened into campus culture had not yet fully taken hold. People were careful. Certainly, in the general sense that anyone living away from home learns to be careful. But they were not living in a permanent crouch. There was no sense, at least not broadly, that a serial predator might be moving among student apartments just as the semester began. That kind of fear belongs to the afterimage of the case, before the murders. Gainesville was not naive so much as unprepared. There is a difference. American college life has always existed in a strange borderland between independence and adolescence. Students are told they are adults. And in many legal and social senses, they are, yet they remain astonishingly young in their habits, their assumptions, and their faith in tomorrow. They believe in next week. They buy groceries for plans they will keep later. They scatter possessions around rooms as if time itself were cooperative. A half-written note on a desk, a class schedule pinned to a wall, shampoo in a shower caddy, an alarm clock set for Monday morning. These are the objects of ordinary continuity. In Gainesville, those objects would become haunted by interruption. But before they became evidence, they were just the scenery of young lives. The students who came to Gainesville came for reasons both practical and idealistic. Some wanted degrees that would carry them into professions. Some wanted distance from home. Some wanted the delicious anonymity of a large campus where they could remake themselves among strangers. Some came because the University of Florida was prestigious, affordable, vibrant, alive with possibility. In another sense, though, they all came for the same reason. They came because youth in America is trained to move toward opportunity. And opportunity often looks like a campus in late summer, with maps in hand and a future still unwritten. What happened in Gainesville struck so deep because it violated that national script. The murders did not occur in some culturally coded zone of obvious menace. They occurred in a setting that parents and students alike had been taught to treat as the beginning of a better life. That was part of the psychic violence. It was not only that 5 people were murdered, it was that the murders took place inside a symbolic landscape associated with growth, aspiration, and controlled risk. A college town is supposed to expose young adults to the world in measured ways. A little freedom, a little danger, late nights, bad decisions, romance, failure, growth. Not slaughter in bedrooms. Not panic crawling through apartment complexes before classes had fully settled into routine. The context of the case also includes the larger American atmosphere of the late 1980s and early 1990s. A time when media saturation was increasing, local horror could rapidly become national horror. And the image of the vulnerable young woman in private space carried enormous emotional charge. Television news, newspapers, and word of mouth all formed a circuit through which fear traveled quickly. Even before all the cultural consequences that would later be attached to cases like Gainesville, the machinery existed for public dread to intensify itself. And yet media alone cannot explain why this case cuts so deeply. Plenty of crimes receive coverage and vanish into the churn of information. Gainesville stayed because it tapped into several primal anxieties at once. There was the fear of being watched, the fear of intrusion, the fear that intelligence and promise offer no shield, the fear that proximity to others means very little when violence chooses stealth over spectacle. There was also the specifically parental fear that sending a child away into adulthood means surrendering the ability to protect them at the precise moment they still seem, in memory, partly childlike. That fear sits quietly beneath much of American family life. A son or daughter leaves for college and the parents perform confidence, practical advice, a smile in the parking lot. But beneath it sits a raw truth. They are going where you cannot follow. In Gainesville, that truth became unbearable. The setting itself deepened the dread. Florida often appears in the American imagination as bright, excessive, unruly. A state of sunlit surfaces and hidden swamps, of vacation imagery laid over older and darker geographies. Gainesville was not Miami or Orlando. It lacked the glamorous or touristic mythology of those places. It was inland, academic, less adorned, but the state's atmosphere still mattered. The heat, the storms, the lush growth, the long late summer twilights all lent the environment a sensual density. Darkness did not arrive crisply there. It thickened. Sounds traveled differently in humid air, the ordinary noises of insects, rustling leaves, distant traffic, a television murmuring through a screen door, all formed an acoustic backdrop against which something predatory could seem both hidden and close. In true crime, setting is never just decoration. It shapes how fear is felt. A narrow hallway in the dry northern winter feels one way. A student apartment in sticky Florida heat, windows sealed against the humidity. Fan turning overhead, night pressing at the glass. Feels another. Gainesville's climate and layout gave the case a bodily texture. Even people who were not there can sense it in retrospect, sweat cooling on skin after a shower. Bare feet on apartment carpet, the muffled sense of being enclosed while the night remains alive just outside. There was also the social geometry of the victim's world. Students often live in transitional communities where people know one another partially rather than completely. A roommate knows your cereal preferences, your class times, your bad mood voice. A neighbor knows what your car looks like and whether you're dating someone. Classmates know your major and your laugh and almost nothing else. This web of partial knowledge is usually benign. It creates belonging without excessive scrutiny, but it also means that routines become visible. Someone attentive enough can learn who lives where, who returns late, who stays alone, who leaves windows uncovered. who seems trusting. The ordinariness of campus life generates patterns. And patterns are comforting until someone malicious begins reading them as opportunities. Gainesville was full of such patterns in August 1990. The semester's opening days are repetitive in useful ways. You buy supplies. You call home. You sleep irregularly. You move through the same blocks and parking lots again and again. To the students living those routines, life felt busy, scattered, ordinary. To a hunter, routine can look like access. This is not to say that the culture of Gainesville caused the murders. It did not. The cause lay in the will and pathology of the murderer. But context matters because crimes do not fall onto blank landscapes. They enter pre-existing emotional worlds. The Gainesville student murders entered a world marked by youth, optimism, transition, porous trust, and the fragile domesticity of student apartments. That is why the violence seemed to contaminate everything around it. Beds were no longer just beds. Windows were no longer just windows. A knock at the door was no longer just a knock. Even the start of the semester itself changed meaning. Instead of symbolizing possibility, it became linked forever in local memory to dread. There are years in the life of a town that sink below the surface and remain there, altering all later memory. For Gainesville, 1990 became one of those years. People who were there would remember not only the killings, but the texture of the days around them, the police presence, the rumors, the way friends spoke more quietly, the way parents called more often, the way campus joy curdled into caution. The murders did not occur in isolation from the city's identity. They entered its bloodstream. And at the center of that context, still unseen in this part of the story, but already moving toward it, was the fact that someone had come into this landscape not to belong to it, not to pass through it harmlessly, but to feed on precisely what made it feel safe. That is the deepest cruelty of the Gainesville case. It took a place made for beginnings and turned it, for a time, into a theater of endings, the bright practical world of classes, roommates, grocery lists, deadlines, and future plans did not vanish. But it was suddenly forced to coexist with something feral and intimate and lethal. The context, then, is not merely Gainesville as a dot on a map or the University of Florida as a campus. The context is a whole emotional ecosystem on the verge of the fall semester, alive with movement, trust, and unfinished lives. The context is humid air and lit windows and parents driving away. The context is youth arranging itself into hopeful shapes just before violence stepped in and broke them. Before the city learned the killer's name, before the newspapers settled on the phrase that would freeze the case in public memory. There were 5 separate young lives moving through the warm, ordinary hours of late August as if tomorrow were guaranteed. The dead are often introduced to the world through the violence done to them, as if the worst night of their lives were the most important thing about them. But in cases like Gainesville, the true wound lies in how much life existed just before the killing. How much personality, effort, affection, vanity, routine, shyness, humor, and private hope had gathered inside these students before a predator forced himself into the center of their stories. If there is such a thing as a victim statement in a case where the victims were denied the chance to speak, it lives in the shape of their lives before they were taken. It lives in the evidence of what they cared about, the rooms they were making their own, the classes they were preparing to take, the friendships they had already built or were only beginning to build. It lives in the stubborn fact that each of them existed as a whole person before the crime reduced them, in the eyes of strangers, to names in a horror story. Gainesville in 1990 was full of students arriving with the usual cargo of youth. But the 5 victims carried especially vivid versions of that cargo. Christina Powell was only 17. A detail that makes her seem even more heartbreakingly close to childhood, though she was already stepping into adult life with the restless determination that often marks very young college students. She had come to Gainesville with plans, with the bright seriousness of someone trying to make a life ahead of schedule. There is something especially vulnerable about people who are young and eager at the same time, who move towards the world with effort already visible on them. They want so badly to belong to the future that they accept the discomforts of transition without complaint. A new town, a new routine, maybe some loneliness. Maybe the strange quiet that falls after parents leave and the room no longer feels temporary but truly yours. Christina was living in that threshold. Her presence in Gainesville represented the American promise in miniature. Work hard. Move forward. Trust that the world will open if you meet it halfway. She did not know she had entered a city about to convulse with fear. She was doing what their young do when they have been told that ambition is a form of safety. She was building a life. Sonia Larson, 18, had a different kind of presence. One marked by intelligence, seriousness, and the poised concentration that people often recognize instantly in students who seem already a little ahead of themselves. She was not merely passing through college as a social phase. She was inhabiting it with purpose. There are young women who move through a campus with the air of someone who has somewhere to be in the larger world and is already studying the map. Sonia seems to belong to that category, one of those people whose future feels not vague but shaped. As if the details may still be unresolved, but the motion is clear. In the soft domestic traces of student life, in the sharing of apartments and schedules and conversations, there was no hint that her life would become part of a nightmare that others would later describe in tones of sensational dread. She, like the others, was busy being specific, being singular, being herself. The tragedy of cases like this is that the public remembers the category while the private world knew the person. Friend, daughter, student, roommate. A voice on the phone, a face leaning over a textbook. A person with habits, a person with moods. A person who occupied space in a way no one else could replicate. Krista Hoyt, 20, was older than Christina and Sonia by only a little. But in college years, those small differences matter. 20 can look composed from the outside. 20 can mean the beginning of a steadier rhythm, a little more confidence, a little more self-possession. She was a student too, but also someone already woven into the work of the city around the university. She had roots in Gainesville in a way that gave her story a slightly different shade. Some people arrive in a college town for the future. Others begin to settle into it, learning the shortcuts, the routines, the small places where daily life gathers. Krista's life held that texture. She was not an abstract victim chosen at random from a distant population. She belonged to the human fabric of Gainesville. She had people who expected to see her, hear from her, cross paths with her again in unremarkable ways. And that is often the cruelest measure of violent loss, not only the dramatic absence left behind, but the missing ordinary things. The shift at work not covered, the phone call not returned, the face not appearing where it should have appeared in a murder case. The body is what shocks the public. The interruption of routine is what crushes the intimate world around the victim. Tracy Pauls, 23. Had the age and bearing of someone already a little further along the road, old enough to feel both close to and slightly apart from the youngest students flowing back into town. 23 in a college environment can make a person seem seasoned, tested, more fully herself. There is often a solidity to women that age. A confidence that comes not from certainty but from experience survived. Tracy had that quality in how she is remembered. A sense of independence and capability, the kind of person who could occupy her own space in the world without apology. She too was part of the semester's living rhythm, moving through work, home, errands, plans. She too was a daughter, a person known from up close, not from headlines. When people looked at Tracy before the murders, they did not see a symbol of vulnerability. They saw a young woman living her life. That is one reason the killings felt so destabilizing. They did not merely target innocence in the sentimental sense. They struck women with different temperaments, different ages, different daily patterns. as if to announce that womanhood itself, inside private space, had become exposed. Then there was Manuel Taboada, 23, whose death altered the emotional shape of the case by reminding everyone that violence of this kind spills beyond the stereotype it seems to choose. He was not collateral in any moral sense, though history sometimes treats him that way when compressing the story into shorthand. He was a real person, a student, a son, a man with his own future. And he was killed because he was there, because intimacy places people within the same circle of danger. Because the killer did not merely invade rooms, but entire lives connected by affection. Manuel's presence in the case matters deeply because it prevents the story from becoming too neat. It was not a crude morality play about isolated female vulnerability alone. It was also about partnership, proximity, shared domestic life, and the fact that love can place a person directly in harm's way in another world. Manuel and Tracy would have continued their life together through all the small routines that make adulthood in this world. They became part of the same crime scene, the same public grief, the same permanent sentence in the history of Gainesville. If the victims could issue a statement, it would not sound like legal language. It would not be a summary prepared for court. It would sound like life continuing right up until it did not. It would sound like keys put down on a table, a shower running, a class time remembered, a phone conversation half serious and half distracted, the kind people have when they assume there will be another one soon. It would sound like students talking about schedules, about jobs, about money, about relationships, about what to wear, about the practical nonsense that fills youth because youth still believes in accumulation. One more day, one more week, one more semester. That is what was stolen in Gainesville. Not only breath, but continuity. The killer forced an ending upon people whose lives were still speaking in the future tense. Christina's statement might be found in her youth itself, in the brave incompleteness of a 17-year-old already trying to step into a larger world. Sonia's statement might be found in her discipline, in the intelligence she carried into Gainesville as both asset and identity. Krista's statement might be found in the textured ordinariness of her life there, in the local rootedness that made her more than a passing student. Tracy's statement might be found in the mature independence of a woman building her own adult shape. Manuel's statement might be found in his place beside the woman he loved, in the shared life that made his death both particular and terrible. None of them left behind a final declaration prepared for the public. Most victims never do. What they leave instead are the patterns by which they had been living. And those patterns become, in the hands of careful memory, a form of testimony. They testify that the victims were not waiting for violence. They testify that these were ordinary young people in ordinary private spaces, engaged in the ordinary business of being alive. They testify that the killer imposed himself on worlds that had not invited him and had every right to remain untouched by him. There is a temptation in notorious cases to lean too quickly into the psychology of the murderer, to treat his obsessions as the key that unlocks the story, but a victim's statement demands the reverse. It asks that the dead be understood not as surfaces onto which the killer projected his fantasies, but as central human beings whose interiority matters even when history cannot fully recover it. Christina was not merely young, she was herself in a way only her family and friends could fully know. Sonia was not merely studious or promising, she was herself. Krista was not merely local, Tracy not merely older, Manuel not merely present. Each of them carried a private weather of memory, habits, fears, jokes, preferences, annoyances, loyalties. Murder does not erase that. Public storytelling often does. That is why this part of the story must linger here, in the territory before reduction. Before forensic detail swallows personality, before readers begin to track the case as if it were a map of clues instead of the aftermath of shattered lives. Somewhere in the apartments where these students lived were objects they had chosen, touched, arranged without ceremony: a bottle of shampoo, a stack of folded clothes, a note on a counter, A book with a bent spine, a favorite shirt, a pair of shoes kicked off carelessly. Such objects become unbearably poignant after violent death because they testify to interrupted intention. No one places a toothbrush by a sink expecting it to become part of a crime scene. No one lays out clothes for the next day expecting there will be no next day to wear them. The rooms in Gainesville were full of these mute statements. They spoke of ordinary expectation. And that expectation is what the killer violated most completely. In another sense, the city itself became a witness speaking on behalf of the victims. The panic that followed did not arise only from the brutality of the crimes. It arose because everyone recognized themselves or someone they loved in the victims' lives. A young woman alone in an apartment. A couple sleeping in what should have been safety. A student beginning the term. A person who had every reason to assume that the world beyond the door would remain beyond it. The town looked at the victims and did not see exotic danger. It saw normal life exposed. That recognition turned sympathy into identification. And identification into fear. But before fear became dominant, there was grief. And grief has a different kind of intelligence. It notices what the dead can no longer say. It notices the mother who no longer gets to hear a daughter's voice change as she grows older. It notices the friend who will always remember a last casual conversation without knowing it was the last. It notices the life events that now exist only as absences. The graduation never attended. The career never started. The wedding never held. The children never born. The aging parents never cared for. The ordinary afternoons never lived. This too is a victim's statement, though it arrives in negative form. It states what was denied. In Gainesville, 5 futures were torn away, and because they belonged to the young. The violence felt multiplied by all the years that should have followed. The case later acquired cultural resonance. Dark glamour in the public imagination, the kind of notoriety that makes people discuss atmosphere and archetype and influence. But all of that came after. At the center remained Christina Powell, Sonia Larson, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manuel Taboada. 5 people whose lives were real before they were famous for having been taken. Their statement to history is not made of courtroom rhetoric. It is made of unfinished lives, of rooms arranged for tomorrow, of trust betrayed, of youth interrupted, of the simple human right to exist unviolated in private space. They did not get to stand in a courtroom and describe the terror that entered their homes. They did not get to tell the city what was taken from them, so the story must do that work as honestly as it can. It must say that they were here, that they mattered individually, that they were not props in the mythology of a serial killer, that their lives had texture, direction, and dignity before violence came. It must say that the true statement of the victims lies in that dignity, in the evidence of lives in progress, and in the enduring obligation of the living to remember them not only for how they died, but for who. In all their ordinary and irreplaceable humanity, they were while they still had time. It began the way many nightmares begin, not with thunder or an obvious omen, but with ordinary evenings settling over a place that believed it understood the rules of night. Late August in Gainesville held heat even after the sun dropped. A thick Florida warmth that pressed against apartment walls and lingered in parking lots long after daylight had gone. Ceiling fans stirred heavy air inside student bedrooms. Lamps glowed behind blinds. The city was still in that restless stretch between summer and the full start of the semester, when people are not yet disciplined by routine and the hours feel loose, shapeless, full of private errands and late conversations somewhere. Students were still out laughing somewhere. Someone was buying a last carton of milk, returning a movie, making plans for the weekend, leaning on a balcony rail and thinking more about classes than danger. Gainesville had not yet fully understood that a predator was already moving inside its ordinary darkness, reading the city differently than everyone else. Not as a place of homes and neighborhoods and student apartments, but as a field of access points, thresholds, sleeping bodies, and silent rooms. The incident did not arrive all at once in public consciousness. It happened first in fragments. In private spaces where the rest of the city could not hear what was unfolding. That is one of the unbearable truths of home invasion murder. It happens behind walls built for privacy, in the exact spaces where people feel least observed by the outside world. A bedroom at night is supposed to be the place where the body finally unclenches, where one steps out of the social performance of the day and becomes defenseless in the innocent sense. Unguarded because one has every right to be. What entered those Gainesville apartments was the opposite of innocence. It was intention. It was stealth sharpened by appetite. It was a man approaching sleeping strangers, not as human beings, but as scenes he meant to control. In the first apartment, 2 young women were inside, Christina Powell and Sonia Larson. Still near the beginning of their semester lives, still enclosed by the small domestic arrangement they had made together. Student apartments have a fragile intimacy to them, especially at night. There are clothes draped over chairs, half-unpacked belongings. Shared bathrooms, notes, calendars, all the temporary architecture of lives trying to settle. The place itself is often modest, but the feeling can be deeply private because the residents are in the middle of inventing adulthood there. That privacy became a trap, sometime in the darkness before morning. The killer entered, not by invitation, not through any social opening, but by forceful trespass into a world that should have been protected by its very ordinariness. One can imagine the night inside that apartment before he crossed the threshold, a fan turning, pipes settling, the faint hum of distant traffic. The soft, dead weight of sleep after a long, hot day. Then the intrusion. The shift in the air that a body sometimes senses before the mind can name it, a presence where no presence should be. The incident, in its immediate physical reality, was violent and intimate. This was not a distant shooting. Not death delivered from outside the room. It required proximity. It required the killer to stand where he had no right to stand, to use his hands, his strength, his will. In the private orbit of his victims, one of the deepest horrors in this case is that the victims were not simply attacked, they were overtaken in spaces that should have belonged entirely to them. Their apartment ceased to be home and became territory occupied by a person determined to make them powerless. There is a particular cruelty in that kind of violence because it does not merely end life. It forces terror into the last moments, forcing the victims to understand that the room around them, the bed, the doorway, the familiar walls, have all failed at once. Christina and Sonia were murdered there, in that student apartment, at the opening edge of a semester that should have contained nothing more sinister than homework, friendships, and the usual ache of becoming independent. Instead, what filled those rooms was panic, struggle, and then silence. By the time the city learned their names in the context of murder, the worst part had already happened in total privacy. No crowd gathered. No alarm saved them. The apartment that had held their ordinary young lives became the first chamber in a wider nightmare. But the horror did not stop there. That is part of what made Gainesville collapse into fear so quickly. One crime can feel like an isolated eruption, hideous but singular. Repetition changes everything. Repetition announces pattern. And pattern means agency still at large. The next attack came at another apartment. Another young woman, another private space invaded in darkness. Krista Hoyt was alone. Solitude, which had seemed normal only hours earlier, became exposure. There is a unique emotional violence in the murder of a person alone at home because it strikes directly at the oldest human bargain with shelter. We build walls and doors not only to keep out weather and thieves, but to preserve the illusion that rest can be secured. That being inside means being removed from the worst impulses of the world. A predator like Danny Rolling attacked that bargain itself. In Krista's apartment, the incident again unfolded in forced intimacy. He entered the enclosed space of another human being and made himself the center of it. What happened there was not random chaos. It bore the shape of ritualized control. That matters because ritual is what transforms violence into message. A spontaneous killing is horrifying, but ritualized brutality seems to speak beyond the act itself. It tells the wider world that the killer is not merely violent, he is staging terror. He is creating scenes meant to be discovered, feared, remembered. Krista's murder deepened the sense that something profoundly wrong was moving through Gainesville. Not an argument turned deadly, not a robbery gone bad, but a predator with a pattern and a psychological hunger larger than the immediate act of killing. By then, the city had begun to shift. News spread. Fear moved faster than facts. Students listened more carefully to hallway sounds. Parents called. Police worked to establish order in an atmosphere already beginning to fray. Yet even as the community's awareness grew, the killer remained active. That is another part of the incident that must be understood not only as chronology, but as emotional progression. The murders did not all happen against a backdrop of ignorance. At a certain point, they happened while fear itself was gathering in the city. That meant every fresh attack carried an added layer of taunt. It suggested that this killer either did not care about the rising alarm or was energized by it. Then came the attack on Tracy Pauls and Manuel Tabora. By this stage, Gainesville was no longer innocent. It was alert. Though not alert enough, because how could it be? A city can sense danger without understanding how to defend against a man willing to move through dark apartment complexes and test private vulnerabilities like a hunter testing fences. Tracy and Manny were together. And that fact changes the emotional shape of the incident again. Two people in a bedroom create a sense of shared safety. Not absolute safety, of course, but the simple human reassurance that one is not alone in the dark. A shared bed means another breathing body, another consciousness nearby, another potential witness, another layer of defense, however fragile. The killer crossed that threshold too. Whatever comfort existed in their togetherness was overwhelmed by the violence that entered with him. Manny was killed first. In the structure of the incident, that detail matters terribly. It suggests the brutal efficiency of domination. The removal of one person in order to control the other. The transformation of intimacy into helplessness. Tracy then faced the killer after seeing the man beside her destroyed. One should not dwell luridly on the mechanics of that scene, but one must not soften its meaning either. It was an act of overpowering cruelty meant to annihilate not only bodies but the very human bonds present in the room. Love, companionship, shared domestic space. All of it was treated as nothing. The killer had entered another apartment and turned it into a site of spectacle and pain. Across these incidents, what unites them is not merely time and perpetrator, it is the predatory logic of entry. He sought out the vulnerability created by ordinary life, student apartments, young people, night, private interiors. The incidents were not abstract acts of violence imposed from outside the social world. They were parasitic on normalcy. They fed on habits people could not avoid having if they wished to live any kind of life at all. Sleep, privacy, trust in walls, trust in routine, trust that a home is where you stop scanning for threat. The killer weaponized those assumptions. And because the attacks unfolded at the beginning of the fall term, the psychological effect was immediate and immense. Students could not help imagining their own rooms, their own doors, their own windows, their own walk home from the car. That is why the incident reverberated so violently through Gainesville. It was local in geography, but universal in implication. Anyone with a bedroom could understand the terror. Anyone with a daughter at college could feel their throat tighten. Anyone living alone could suddenly hear the architecture of their home differently. The city's atmosphere changed between one evening and the next. Apartment complexes that had felt merely worn or modest now seemed exposed. The sound of a footstep outside a door no longer passed unnoticed. People who had moved through campus with the ordinary elasticity of youth began to bunch together, to look over shoulders, to negotiate darkness in groups. Yet all of this came after the incidents themselves. After the moments when each victim was still trapped inside the narrowing circle of a killer's control, there is a temptation, in retelling such cases, to let the broader public panic overshadow the private experience of the victims. But the incident was not first a media event. It was first a series of human encounters with death, occurring in enclosed rooms where young people were forced to confront the final betrayal of safety. The soundscape of those nights will never be fully recoverable. But the imagination recoils toward it, a gasp, a scuffle, the thud of struggle. The terror of realizing that the person in the room is not a roommate, not a friend, not a lover returning late, but a stranger carrying violence with purpose. Then the aftermath, that hideous stillness crime scenes so often hold, as if the room itself has withdrawn from what happened there. The Gainesville murders were especially destabilizing because the incident had a cumulative rhythm. Each attack seemed to expand the perimeter of dread. The first crimes shattered assumptions. The later ones confirmed that the shattering was not over. Each new body told the town that the killer's appetite had not been satisfied, that the unseen figure moving through its residential spaces remained active, alert, and frighteningly capable of approaching without warning. This sense of progression is essential to understanding why the murders became more than homicide in public memory. They became a siege of the imagination. A city can absorb a single atrocity and call it tragedy. Multiple atrocities of similar shape become a pattern the mind cannot stop rehearsing. Who is next? Where will he go? Which apartment complex? Which window? Which student? Those questions were not asked in theory. They were asked by people brushing teeth before bed, by parents at telephones, by officers driving patrol, by young women pulling curtains shut with hands that had begun to shake. The incident also marked a turning point in how Gainesville understood space itself. Before the murders, distance from campus might have been measured in convenience, rent, noise level, parking. Afterward, space became tactical. First floor or second floor? Sliding glass door or not? How much light in the lot? How far from neighbors? Whether the lock held? Whether the bushes by the window were too dense? This transformation did not occur in the abstract. It was driven by the structure of the attacks. The killer had shown that he could step across the boundary between public quiet and private annihilation with terrifying ease. That knowledge stayed. It stays in all communities marked by home invasion murder. People no longer experience domestic space as innocent. They study it. They imagine how it could be entered, how long it would take someone to hear a scream, whether anyone would come. These are the afterlives of the incident. But they are born directly from the way the crimes were committed, and at the center of all of it was Danny Rolling. Though his name was not yet fixed in the city's mind as the source of its terror in the incident phase of the story, he was still largely an absence with effects, a hidden will inferred from the violence he left behind. That invisibility amplified everything. A known enemy can at least be pictured. An unknown predator becomes more than a man in the imagination of the threatened. He becomes every shadow, every unexplained noise, every strange face glimpsed in a parking lot. Gainesville was dealing not only with the facts of murder, but with the psychological blast radius created by not yet knowing exactly who had done it or where he might appear next. This is what makes part 4 of the story so brutal. It is not simply the recounting of deaths. It is the movement of violence through intimate space before the city can fully defend itself. The transformation of apartments into traps, of young lives into scenes of interruption, of ordinary nights into historical rupture. The incident was the crossing point between the hopeful world of a semester beginning and the hunted world that followed. It was the moment when the predator's private fantasy collided with the daily reality of Gainesville and left behind blood, silence, and a fear so immediate that the city seemed to change shape around it in the space of those few nights. The ordinary rhythm of students living, sleeping, and planning was invaded by a man who understood how to turn rooms into theaters of terror. When morning came after each attack, the sun rose on the same roads, the same trees, the same campus buildings, but the city receiving that sunlight was no longer the city that had gone to bed. Morning has a different moral weight after murder. In an ordinary apartment complex, dawn is supposed to soften things. It reveals the harmless structure of the night, turns shadows back into shrubs and stair rails and parked cars, lets neighbors step out with coffee and a yawn and the dull confidence that whatever fears flickered in the dark belonged to imagination. But in Gainesville, in those last days of August 1990, daylight did not restore order. It exposed rupture. It fell on doors that should have opened and did not. It stretched across parking lots where routine should have resumed and instead paused under the pressure of something wrong. The crime scene is often imagined as a fixed place, a room already sealed in yellow tape. But in reality, it begins earlier than that. It begins in unease. It begins in the small hesitation when a friend cannot reach someone, when a workplace expects a person who never arrives, when the ordinary timetable of life slips just enough to make concern rise in the throat. In the Gainesville murders, the crime scenes emerged from that fragile edge between absence and discovery, when daily expectations still tried, for a few moments, to explain away what violence had already done. The first apartment, where Christina Powell and Sonia Larson were found, held all the ordinary markers of student life, and that contrast is one reason its discovery carried such force. Student apartments are not grand spaces, they are improvised, provisional, often cluttered by necessity rather than taste. A bag by the door, dishes not yet washed, a note on a counter, clothes laid out without ceremony. The small debris of people who assume they will continue living in the same place tomorrow. When murder enters such a room, it does not erase the domestic world, it leaves it there, horribly intact around the damage. That is part of what unsettles investigators and ordinary people alike. The toothpaste still sits by the sink, the fan still turns. The apartment still contains signs of appetite, vanity, boredom, plans, and among those signs is death, final and obscene. The crime scene in that first apartment was not merely evidence of homicide, it was evidence of intrusion into a life in progress. The very ordinariness of the surroundings sharpened the horror. Here were young women at the beginning of a school term, inside a rented space built for study, sleep, and the awkward freedoms of early adulthood. And here, in the middle of that familiar setting, was a level of brutality that transformed the apartment from home into a message. Investigators arriving at a scene like that do not confront only bodies, they confront atmosphere. Something in the room declares that the normal order of human behavior has been violated with particular force. There's the visual shock. Of course, the immediate task of securing the scene, noting points of entry, preserving whatever trace evidence might still survive the first flood of urgent movement. But there is also the impression a room makes before language catches up to it. In Gainesville, those first scenes suggested not only murder, but staging, not only violence, but the deliberate construction of terror. That distinction matters because experienced investigators often feel it before they can fully articulate it. A room can communicate that the killer did not merely want the victims dead. He wanted the discovery itself to wound the living. He wanted police, friends, neighbors, the city, to receive the scene as a blow. The first clues were therefore both physical and psychological. Physical, in the sense of forced entry, disturbed interiors, the pattern of attack, the bodily evidence left behind. Psychological, in the sense that the arrangement and brutality suggested a perpetrator operating with a predatory mindset larger than the immediate act. He was not acting inside a simple quarrel. He was imposing himself on private space with a kind of ritual intent. That realization would become crucial, but at the beginning, the task was simpler and more desperate. Determine what happened. Determine whether the killer had come from within the victim's circle or from outside it. Determine whether the city was dealing with a singular eruption or the beginning of something worse, even in the first apartment. Clues would have begun to point toward a terrifying answer. There were signs that entry had been forced. That mattered immediately. Forced entry narrows the emotional field of a case. It tells investigators they're not looking first at domestic conflict or familiar access. It says intrusion. It says the threat came from outside the normal trust structure of the home. In a college town, that realization lands hard because so much of student life depends on porous social boundaries. Friends stop by. Neighbors drift in and out. A boyfriend or classmate may already know the layout of a room. Forced entry cuts through all of that and says this was not ordinary access. This was an invasion. It is one of the first facts that turns a murder from tragic into publicly alarming. If someone is willing to breach doors or windows and attack sleeping young people, then the danger is not confined to personal grudges. It is environmental. It belongs to the city now. The discovery of Krista Hoyt's body added another layer to the developing picture. By then, the idea of coincidence was already beginning to fracture. Separate victims, similar invasions, intimate and savage violence inside private residences, all of it occurring within a compressed stretch of time near the university. A pattern was taking shape faster than anyone wanted it to. Krista's apartment, like the first, would have confronted investigators with that same unbearable mingling of the ordinary and the monstrous. A lived-in room, the residue of a young woman's routine. A place where someone had showered, slept, dressed, perhaps planned the next day. And then the unmistakable signs of attack. Crime scenes like these force police into two modes at once. One is technical and procedural, almost cold by necessity. Photograph everything, preserve fibers. Check for fingerprints, note the window, the door, the path of movement. Establish time of death, compare similarities. The other mode is interpretive. What kind of offender does this? What does the level of violence tell us? Was he interrupted? Was he organized? Did he know the victim or choose the location for opportunity? Every clue exists in both registers. A broken point of entry is not just physical evidence. It is behavioral evidence. The arrangement of the room is not just a map of struggle. It is a glimpse into the offender's priorities, his confidence, his timing, his psychological need to control the environment. The murder of Tracy Pauls and Manuel Taboada deepened the evidentiary horror and made the pattern impossible to ignore. Two victims in one apartment changed the calculus without easing the dread. If anything, it made the offender seem more formidable, more committed, more willing to overpower multiple people in a confined space. The crime scene there would have delivered an especially brutal set of initial clues. Manny had been killed. Tracy attacked and murdered afterward, and the apartment itself bore witness to a sequence of domination rather than a simple explosion of violence. Investigators look for sequence because sequence reveals decision. It reveals who the offender addressed first, how he controlled the scene, whether he adapted under stress, whether he was surprised, whether he planned for the possibility of two occupants. A chaotic offender can kill more than one person, certainly. But a patterned offender reveals something else, a confidence that private interiors can be mastered. This was one of the most frightening emerging clues in Gainesville. The killer seemed able to enter unfamiliar residences and quickly bend them to his will. That implies rehearsal of some kind. If not literal practice, then psychological preparation. It implies fantasy becoming action. It implies an offender whose mind had already visited these scenes before his body ever did. Investigators in 1990 did not have the forensic abundance later decades would imagine. DNA analysis existed, but was not yet the swift. Routine miracle modern audiences often project backward into older cases. That meant the early clues mattered all the more in their immediate material form, fibers, fingerprints, shoe impressions, pry marks, signs of entry. blood patterns, witness statements, timelines, neighborhood canvases. The humble architecture of homicide work, a city in panic wants instant answers. But murder investigations begin with painstaking attention to the stubborn details that do not panic at all. A thread caught somewhere it should not be. A latent print, a statement from a neighbor who heard something but dismissed it in the night. A report of a suspicious man, a vehicle seen near an apartment complex. These clues are often frustrating because each one seems small compared with the scale of the horror, but murder is solved. If it is solved, by treating small things as carriers of larger truth. In Gainesville, officers were confronted with multiple scenes, multiple victims, and a killer whose method suggested mobility, stealth, and a deeply predatory appetite. The first clue is therefore the linkage itself. Linkage is not always obvious in serial cases, especially early, but here the similarities were too strong to ignore. Young victims, student environment, nighttime intrusion, savage close-range violence. Residential settings, the city was not looking at disconnected tragedies. It was looking at a spree of intimate killings committed by someone still out there. That realization hit law enforcement and the public at nearly the same time. Though not with equal precision, police saw emerging behavior. The public saw terror. Both were correct. Another initial clue lay in the sheer audacity of the offender. Audacity is evidence. It suggests a willingness to take risk, which in turn suggests things about personality, geography, and confidence. A killer who invades multiple apartments near a university during the beginning of term is either profoundly reckless or disturbingly assured that he can approach, attack, and leave without detection. That narrows the psychological field. Such offenders often derive part of their excitement from the challenge itself, from the act of crossing into spaces other people trust. This is not the same as saying investigators immediately knew who they were hunting. They did not. But the scenes told them something about the kind of mind at work. The offender was not merely opportunistic in the ordinary sense. He was energized by penetration of private space. He was creating scenes whose discovery would amplify fear. He was comfortable enough with blood, proximity, and physical domination to repeat himself. These are not small insights. They are the beginning of a profile, even before the word profile becomes public language. There is also the question of what was not found. Missing objects can matter as much as present ones. Signs of robbery, or the lack of them, shape how a case is interpreted in its first days. In Gainesville, the crimes did not read like burglaries derailed into panic. The level and nature of violence made that clear. That, too, was an initial clue. If valuables were left, if the rooms did not show the rummaging logic of theft, then motive had to be located elsewhere. Sexual violence, domination, fantasy, rage. The desire to terrify. Once investigators begin using those words privately, the emotional tone of a case changes. They are no longer merely looking for someone desperate or impulsive. They are looking for someone driven by dark internal needs. The crime scenes in Gainesville pointed towards such a person almost immediately. The effect on the community was immediate and overwhelming, yet the crime scene does not end when officers leave and the tape goes up. It radiates outward. Friends arrive and are stopped. Families are notified. Reporters gather. Neighboring tenants look at their own doors differently. A whole geography becomes contaminated by knowledge. In Gainesville, apartment complexes and quiet roads acquired a new emotional charge. Places that had been navigated casually now felt marked. The city itself became an extended crime scene in the psychological sense, because the killer had used its architecture, its rhythms, its student population, its assumptions about safety. Every window became the possible entry point in the public imagination. Every dark stairwell seemed to belong to the logic of the crimes. The initial clues therefore included not only what police found at the apartments, but what the city began to understand about itself. It understood that vulnerability could be ordinary. It understood that violence had walked through the same warm nights and parking lots its students inhabited. It understood that danger was not somewhere else. For investigators, however, understanding is never enough. They needed direction. They would have pursued timelines, trying to pin the attacks to precise hours. They would have canvassed neighborhoods for strange sounds, unfamiliar vehicles. Anyone seen lingering, they would have studied method. How was entry achieved? Was the same approach used across scenes? Did the killer cut power, choose rear access? Exploit ground floor windows, move on foot? Each answer, even tentative, mattered. A killer's method of approach can reveal whether he is local, whether he scouts in advance, whether he improvises, whether he is physically bold or strategically cautious. Crime scenes are never silent to trained eyes, but they rarely speak in a single clear sentence. They offer fragments, and those fragments must be assembled under pressure. In Gainesville, the pressure was enormous because every hour without an arrest left the possibility of another crime hanging over the city. This is one reason the early scenes loom so large in the story. They were not simply records of what had happened. They were the first battlefield in a race between investigators trying to interpret a killer, and a killer who had already demonstrated his ability to move faster than the city's sense of safety. Looking back, it is easy to say that these clues pointed toward a serial predator. In the moment, however, clarity arrives unevenly. Officers had to work through horror without being ruled by it, had to see sequence inside bloodshed, had to preserve evidence while the community around them slid toward panic. And all the while, the scenes themselves remained what they were, rooms where young lives had been violently interrupted. That fact must remain central. Forensics can harden a case into diagrams and terms. But every clue in Gainesville began inside the broken privacy of students who should have been able to sleep behind closed doors. The first clues were pry marks and violence, linkage and pattern, audacity and staging. The deeper clue, the one the city felt before it could name it, was that someone was not only killing, someone was choosing intimacy as his hunting ground. Someone was turning the most ordinary spaces in a college town into chambers of dread. That realization, born in those first crime scenes, would shape everything that followed. The panic, the investigation, the search for suspects, and the terrible understanding that the person responsible was not finished merely because the sun had come up. By the time Gainesville understood that it was not dealing with a single burst of violence, but a sequence, the city had already begun to divide itself into zones of suspicion. A college town is built on circulation. People move constantly through half-familiar spaces, crossing paths with neighbors they barely know, classmates they recognize but cannot name, mechanics, bartenders, delivery drivers, men leaning against trucks in parking lots, workers stepping out for smoke breaks, students drifting home at hours that blur into one another. In ordinary life, this constant flow of strangers creates a background hum, a democratic anonymity that feels natural in places shaped by youth and movement. But once a serial killer is believed to be operating within that landscape, anonymity turns poisonous. Every unknown face begins to carry a possible second meaning. The same quality that makes a college town feel socially open begins to make it feel porous. That was the atmosphere in which the investigation widened and the suspects multiplied. Police were not only hunting one man, they were also trying to manage the public imagination before it exploded into chaos. The problem, of course, was that chaos had already begun. Fear is a terrible detective. It notices everything and understands almost nothing. In Gainesville, the public did what frightened communities always do. It generated explanations. Some were grounded, some absurd, some cruel, some simply desperate. Rumor filled the distance between fact and reassurance, and because the victims were students and the crime scenes carried signs of intimate, deliberate brutality, the city instinctively began scanning for men who seemed to fit whatever shape terror happened to take that day. This is the first dead end in cases like these, and one of the most inevitable. When the offender is unknown, a community starts making him out of the materials nearest at hand. A strange maintenance worker, a drifter seen near apartments, a former boyfriend, a man who stared too long at a grocery store, someone with a temper, someone with a criminal record, someone who lived alone, someone too quiet, someone not quiet enough. Investigators, meanwhile, had to separate the truly useful from the merely plausible. That is easy to say in retrospect and brutally hard in real time. The suspect pool in a multiple homicide case expands almost immediately because every victim brings a network. Every scene produces names, and every city under pressure throws its unease into police hands in the form of tips. Friends, exes, co-workers, neighbors, family acquaintances, transient laborers, known offenders in the area, recent arrestees, sexual predators, prowlers, burglars, men with histories of violence against women, anyone who had behaved oddly in the days before or after the murders. All of them had to be considered. The murders of Christina Powell and Sonia Larson alone would have required investigators to trace a whole architecture of access and association. Who knew where they lived? Who had been inside the apartment? Who had noticed their routines? Who might have fixated on one or both of them? Then Krista Hoyt's murder extended the pattern and the pressure. She was older, had local roots, and moved through a somewhat different social orbit. That mattered because overlapping victimology can clarify a killer's method, while divergence can confuse it if the victims do not all belong to one tight social circle. The theory of personal vendetta weakens if they share only age range, setting, and vulnerability. The theory begins to slide toward opportunistic predation, but even then, police cannot skip past the human groundwork. They must still look hard at the known men in each victim's life because killers sometimes appear pattern-driven until one connection collapses the whole theory. This is the painful discipline of homicide work. You do not get to prefer the more dramatic explanation before exhausting the ordinary ones. So the investigation moved outward and inward at once, outward toward the city, toward prowler reports, prior sexual assaults, burglaries, suspicious vehicles, drifters, purlees, strangers seen loitering near apartment complexes, inward toward the victims' personal lives, romantic relationships, tensions, former partners, arguments, acquaintances, anything that might suggest directed hostility. Each route created suspects. Each route also created disappointment. The most haunting thing about dead ends is not that they are wrong. It is that for a few hours or days, they often feel frighteningly right. Someone's name rises. A detail fits. An alibi seems thin. A neighbor reports strange behavior. The police lean in. The media leans in harder. The public seizes on the possibility because terror craves a face. Then the person is cleared, or the forensic timeline fails, or the behavioral pattern does not hold, or the suspect was simply the nearest man around whom fear could gather. This repeated itself in Gainesville. The pressure on investigators was immense because the city wanted not a process, but a capture. It wanted one man in handcuffs and a clean line drawn around the nightmare. What it got instead, at least for a time, was the slow and maddening truth that a serious investigation is built as much from exclusion as identification. Suspects had to be found and then discarded. Leads had to be chased until they went cold. A report that sounded promising at midnight could look useless by morning, and all the while the background terror remained unchanged. The killer had already shown that he could move through private space with horrifying confidence. If he was still in the area, every false lead felt not merely frustrating but dangerous. One of the first broad categories investigators would have had to examine was the sexual predator or violent prowler known to local law enforcement. This is standard, but in a campus-centered murder spree, it becomes urgent. Men previously arrested for burglary, peeping, Stalking or assault near student residences suddenly become high-interest names. So do drifters and transients, especially in a state like Florida where mobility and anonymity can overlap in unsettling ways. Yet this category of suspect often becomes a dead end precisely because it is so large. Communities under fear tend to imagine the offender as someone visibly marginal, someone already marked by society as threatening. That can happen. Certainly, but not always in ways that make quick detection easy. The danger in leaning too hard on this theory is that it can produce endless noise. A dozen men may look bad on paper. A few may even behave strangely under questioning, but oddness is not guilt. And prior criminality is not proof of these crimes. Gainesville investigators had to sift through all of that while the public interpreted each police movement as a sign that the answer was close. Another route led through the victim's circles, particularly men connected romantically or emotionally to the women. This is inevitable in homicide, and often justified. Intimate partners and former partners do commit violent crimes at devastating rates, and police cannot ignore that simply because a case has serial overtones. But this line of inquiry, too, can become a dead end when the murders bear signs of stranger predation more than personal grievance. Still, detectives would have studied boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, male friends, rejected admirers, roommates, acquaintances, anyone whose name lived close enough to the victims to merit scrutiny. In some cases, this kind of investigation inflicts a secondary trauma on the living. People already shattered by the deaths of those they loved suddenly become objects of suspicion. Their grief is read through forensic suspicion. Their gaps in memory become troubling. Their emotional presentation becomes evidence to strangers. Too calm, too distraught, too detailed, not detailed enough. The social violence of a murder investigation often falls hardest on the innocent people nearest the dead. Gainesville was no exception. There were men who had to answer impossible questions simply because they had loved or known one of the victims. That is not police cruelty. It is investigative necessity, but it is still a kind of ordeal. And when those men are cleared, what remains is a bitter residue. They are innocent, yet they have already been briefly cast in the role of monster. Then there were the stranger theories, the ones born from the geography of the attacks. Because the murders happened in apartments near the university and involved forced entry, investigators had to consider whether the killer had worked in or around those environments. Maintenance men, utility workers, handymen, movers, security guards, delivery people, service workers, anyone whose labor placed him near doors, stairwells, window lines, parking lots, and student routines. This is an intelligent line of inquiry because access often hides inside ordinary labor. A man fixing pipes or checking meters can study layouts without drawing alarm. A worker present in the day may reappear at night in another capacity entirely. But here again lies a dead end common to high-fear investigations. The pool becomes huge, and the innocent among it can appear suspicious simply because their jobs brought them physically close to vulnerable spaces. In Gainesville, police had to ask who could have known the apartment configurations, who might have watched women moving in, who could have blended into the residential environment without attracting immediate notice. It was a sound question, but not every sound question yields the right answer. The culture of fear widened the search still further. Reports came in from people who had seen men lurking, heard noises outside windows, encountered strangers on foot, noticed unfamiliar cars, recalled odd conversations that had seemed harmless until the murders gave them sinister color. Every one of those memories had to be measured. The trouble with retrospective suspicion is that once a community has been traumatized, memory becomes crowded with menace. The man who merely asked for directions now feels like a stalker in recollection. The parked car that may have belonged to a visitor becomes a surveillance vehicle in the mind. Investigators must absorb these accounts without drowning in them. That is harder than it sounds, because occasionally, one of those vague public recollections is the thread that breaks the case open. Ignore too much, and you miss the killer. chase everything, and you lose the shape of the crime itself. Gainesville's investigation had to navigate that razor edge while the city's nerves frayed further with each passing day. Meanwhile, broader behavioral theories were forming. Police could see that the offender was physically confident, capable of entering occupied residences, controlling the victims, and leaving behind scenes that suggested more than simple homicide. This gave the investigation a psychological contour. They were likely dealing with a sexually motivated killer, organized enough to select settings and move through them, but perhaps not so polished as to leave no trail at all. A man like that might have prior offenses. He might escalate, he might travel,